Welcome back to the deep dive. This is the show where we take one, sometimes microscopic point of failure, a tiny, tiny detail, and we use it as a lens to understand these massive organizational problems, historical context, and just the incredibly high cost of cutting corners.
And today we are taking a pretty dramatic chronological detour. We are, strapping on our Roman sandals and heading all the way back to the Pax Romana, the year 117 AD.
But we're bringing something with us that, well, won't actually be invented for another 1,000 years or so.
A humble pistol.
Yeah, exactly. Our focus today is on this huge, completely self-inflicted credibility crisis that recently hit the developers of the new city builder, Anno 117, Pax Romana.
And the spark for this whole thing. A visual asset so small, so easily fixable, it's almost hard to believe.
It really is. Picture this, a pirate ship sailing the Roman seas, flying a flag with a skull, and unmistakably a pair of modern-looking firearms.
So, just to set the scene for you, the listener, you're supposed to be playing as a Roman governor, right?
Yeah.
An imperial magistrate. Your whole job is managing the complex logistics of governing provinces like Latium, the Heartland, or maybe the wild frontier of Albion.
And your world is completely defined by the technology of the 2nd century. So when you go to build your military, your warships, you're using period-accurate Roman tech. You've got your fleet outfitted with ballistae, maybe a Scorpio for accuracy, or just the brute force of a catapult.
You're ready to take on the pirates? A constant scourge.
And then you zoom in. You zoom in on the enemy ship, and there it is. That classic pirate flag, the Jolly Roger. But instead of crossed swords or bones, you see it.
A pair of crossed pistols.
This one tiny misplaced graphic, an image that someone just forgot to replace, it created a public firestorm. And it wasn't just, aesthetic nitpicking.
Yeah, no, not at all. This one small error,
Yeah.
it became a viral signal for what a lot of players feared was a much larger pattern of neglect.
The chronological breach here is what's just staggering.
Oh, it's not just a small error. We're not talking about like a 50-year mistake or even 100. This asset vaults the game's identity forward by over 1,000 years.
So these Roman-era pirates are flying the insignia of enemies that won't even exist until, what, the late medieval period?
Or even the early modern period, really. And the community response was just immediate. The Reddit thread about it didn't just get a few comments, it exploded. It got over 1,300 upvotes, which, for a focused community like that, it signals this fundamental shared collapse of immersion.
Yeah, that's a big deal.
And from an analytical perspective, this is so much more than a graphical glitch. For anyone studying game development, this is a perfect textbook case study in what you'd call asset pipeline failure.
Asset pipeline failure.
Yeah, it's where these high-level corporate decisions about efficiency, like let's reuse as many assets as possible, cascade all the way down into these critical, very visible errors that just, they directly damage the brand.
Wait, so you're telling me Trajan's legions are out there fighting enemies whose flag represents technology from after the Renaissance?
That's the absurdity of it, yeah.
It's just, if this error saved, what, an hour of an artist's time? How much did the fallout actually cost them? That's what we have to figure out.
Exactly. This tiny image, what we're calling the $60 pistol, it carries this massive weight of organizational debt.
Okay, let's unpack this. All right, let's start by really establishing the historical boundaries. Because the crime scene, it only matters if we understand the rules of the world they were building.
Right. Anno 117. Pax Romana puts us squarely in 117 AD. This is the absolute peak of the Roman Empire, right at that transition point after Emperor Trajan dies and Hadrian comes to power.
So the Pax Romana, it was all about consolidation, building infrastructure, refining that famous Roman bureaucracy.
Precisely. And the entire setting of the game, from how you plan your cities to your economy, it's all defined by 2nd century Roman technology. The whole challenge for you, the player, is to impose that Roman template, that standardized geometric city design, onto these far-flung provinces.
Places like the heartland of Latium, or the rugged, newly acquired territory of Britannia, which they call Albion in the game.
Yeah, and the technological identity of this era is, it's primitive by our standards, but it's powerful. It's defined by bronze and iron, by skilled labor, and some incredibly effective, if mechanically simple, engineering.
And that applies directly to naval conflict, which is a huge part of the Anno experience, especially with those pirates.
That's right. You're not sailing battleships, you're in triremes, quadriremes. These are vessels that rely on oars and sails, and combat is all about close quarters boarding or, more importantly, deploying siege engines you've mounted on the deck.
Naval warfare against pirates is purely early siege tech.
Exactly.
So can you break down the arsenal? What exactly are these Roman governors using to fight?
Sure. The main shipboard weapons all rely on torsion and tension, right? Not chemical combustion.
Yeah.
So you have the ballista, which is basically a giant crossbow. It's great for punching holes in enemy hulls from a medium distance. Then you have the catapult. It's a massive throwing arm. Gives you a lot of blunt force to destroy structures, but it's notoriously less accurate against moving ships.
Right, a bigger, clumsier weapon.
And then there's the Scorpio. This was often called the Roman machine gun. Now, it's still a torsion-powered bolt thrower, but it's smaller, it's lighter, which allowed for way greater accuracy and a higher rate of fire against individual targets.
So that's the high-tech option of the era.
It was the most refined weapon they had. So the player's whole strategy revolves around managing the strengths and weaknesses of these ancient actions. That rigid framework is the technological identity of a 117 AD in the game. It's the one thing you have to respect for the premise to work.
And when you think about that level of detail, I mean, the complexity just to model a Scorpio, the contrast with the pistol it's almost comical.
It is.
Which brings us to this idea of a severity index for historical errors. We need to distinguish between what players will forgive and what they just absolutely will not tolerate.
Yeah, you can basically classify these inaccuracies into two types. First, you have your soft anachronisms. These are, minor details that players often just let slide because they're needed for gameplay, or they add some kind of flavor.
And the classic example that came up in the community discussions was finding corn or maize on a Roman ship.
Exactly. Maize is a New World crop. It didn't get to Europe until after the Columbian Exchange, which is, a 1,400-year difference?
A huge gap.
But if the game needs a generic foodstuff to complete an economic loop, most players will just shrug and call it artistic license. It's an accepted compromise to make the game playable.
But this pistol sale thing, it's in a completely different league. This is operating at the highest level of severity.
It's the highest severity because it's purely cosmetic. It adds nothing to the game's function. It doesn't add a resource. It doesn't help the narrative. It offers zero entertainment value. It just exists as a glaring mistake with absolutely no justification.
And the severity really comes from that technological chasm, doesn't it? The firearm itself.
It's an undeniable violation of the timeline. I mean, the firearms depicted, players zoomed right in and confirmed they have a trigger guard and a flintlock mechanism.
A flintlock? That's really specific.
It's incredibly specific. That represents the widespread adoption of gunpowder technology. While gunpowder existed in, rudimentary forms in Asia way earlier, sophisticated handheld weapons like a flintlock pistol belong squarely in the 17th or 18th century.
Wow.
We're violating well over 1,000 years of technological progression. The Scorpio is powered by twisted rope. The flintlock is powered by chemical combustion. They are conceptually alien to each other. It's an error that just shatters the thematic foundation of the whole game.
So let's get down to the visual crime scene. What did players specifically spot that pinned this asset to the future?
The visual details were everything. The iconography was a skull and cross arms, but the arms were clearly guns. Players noted the anatomy, the long barrel, the distinctive grip, the trigger, and that flintlock apparatus.
And that specific mechanism, the flintlock, that's what screamed Anno 1800.
Exactly. The sophistication of that weapon immediately confirmed its origin. It had to come from the pirate faction assets of the studio's previous, hugely successful industrial age game. In Anno 1800, flintlock pistols on a pirate sail are perfectly accurate. It makes sense.
But here it creates this huge cognitive dissonance for the player. You, the Roman governor, you're spending your time and resources figuring out the best way to use your torsion-powered ballistae to fight these pirates. And yet the enemy's flag, their brand, basically, is communicating that they're sailing around with imagery from the height of the British Empire.
The visual language completely betrays the functional reality of the game. You're engaged in ancient naval combat, but the enemy's aesthetic is 1,000 years too advanced. This thematic failure provided the perfect, simple, undeniable proof for every single underlying complaint the community had about the game's integrity.
It turned a simple graphical oversight into a total conceptual failure. This whole issue really forces us to look at the studio's design philosophy, because whenever a historical game takes liberties, the developers always have a defense ready.
Right, and for the Anno franchise, that consistent defense is that the game is historically inspired and was never historically accurate.
And that's not just some PR line, is it? It's kind of foundational to how Anno even works.
It's absolutely foundational to its success. It gives them the creative latitude they need to build those complex economic loops and supply chains that players love. I mean, if the game were strictly 100% accurate to 117 AD, the deep logistics simulation that defines Anno would be impossible.
So they claim artistic license for entertainment purposes.
But the key distinction the studio tries to make is that they only use that license strategically. They call their ability to intentionally break realism their trump card.
A trump card. So they only play it when they have to.
That's the vital difference, or so they claim. They reserve the right to deviate from history only when that deviation leads to a demonstrably better version of the game. It all comes down to the intentionality of the choice.
And a great example of that, one they've talked about and that players mostly accepted, was including female characters in positions of power.
Yeah, historically, 117 AD Roman society was, a deeply patriarchal society. But the studio consciously chose to break that rule. Why?
Yeah.
To make the character roster better, to increase player engagement, to provide more variety.
It was a strategic choice, and it was intentional.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it offered a clear, tangible benefit to the player. It was also, and this is crucial, grounded in some credibility. Powerful Roman women did exist, even if they were the exception.
So the rule is, you can break history, but only if it makes the game functionally better or more fun.
That's the philosophy. Now, contrast that successful strategic choice with this accidental pistol sale. This asset reuse just cannot be justified by their own stated philosophy. Does adding a flintlock motif enhance gameplay? No. Does it add narrative depth? Absolutely not.
Does it make the game more enjoyable?
Quite the opposite. Its inclusion is just a straight-up failure of oversight. It violates the very integrity of the design license they claim to value so much.
And here's where it gets really interesting. Because the failure suggests something non-artistic was the priority. The community analysis points straight to development efficiency, specifically saving what might have been, one logo and an hour of an artist's work.
And that is where you fundamentally erode player trust. When the studio takes a calculated liberty, like with the female characters, it's seen as beneficial fiction. But when they include an accidental flaw of this magnitude, players stop seeing artistic license and start seeing professional carelessness.
Or rushing, or just cost-cutting.
Right. The whole philosophical justification for taking liberties just collapses when the error provides zero artistic benefit. It goes from an intentional design choice to an accidental operational slip-up.
And that's a massive shift in perception.
The irony is just, it's so rich. They invested all this effort into justifying a major historical break with gender roles, which the audience liked, only to lose all that credibility over a tiny visual detail that was probably just forgotten in a folder somewhere.
So the community saw it as a clear signal.
A clear signal that the internal QA process valued speed over thematic integrity.
So diving into the technical side of this, the consensus in the community, and it seems to be backed up by all the analysis, it points to one clear cause: cross-era asset migration.
Almost certainly from Anno 1800, yeah.
So to understand the failure, we have to understand the process. A studio making a new game in a long-running series like Anno, they never start from scratch.
Almost never. They reuse engine parts, functional code, folder structures from the last successful game, which in this case was Anno 1800. And reusing functional code is smart. It's standard industry practice. It saves millions, and it stops you from introducing new bugs into systems that already work.
But the key difference here, the one the studio seems to have missed, is between reusable code and context-specific visual assets.
Absolutely. The pirate faction in Anno 1800 was a whole system. It had its own AI, its own ship models, and, yes, a folder of assets with their branding, including that skull and cross pistols texture for the sails.
So when they were building the pirate faction for Anno 117, they probably just copied the whole functional folder over.
That's the most likely scenario. They updated the ship model, maybe tweaked the AI code, but they just missed replacing that one visual texture buried deep in the asset hierarchy.
And the community reaction was pretty cynical, labeling it as lazy copy-pasta content they just didn't replace.
Which is understandable. It immediately undermines any sense of artistic dedication. And this leads us to a really key concept in organizational failure, which you can call asset integrity debt.
Asset integrity debt. Okay.
By reusing the complex asset pipeline from a completely different era, the industrial age, they saved a few hours of work for maybe a junior artist. But in doing so, they introduced this massive latent liability, the asset integrity debt.
That sounds a lot like what happens in IT, where you use a quick, dirty fix today that causes a total system meltdown 5 years from now.
It is the perfect analogy. That old asset, the pistol texture, was like an obsolete security protocol on an old server.
Yeah.
That debt was called due the moment QA failed to catch it,
Right.
and the result was this highly public, immersion-shattering collapse.
And when you look at the operational cost, the initial saving is just. It's negligible. Saving an hour of work has led to days of senior developer time patching it, huge reputational damage, viral mockery that will live on the internet forever.
Not to mention hours of PR crisis management. The operational cost just massively outweighs the tiny initial saving. This is a classic case where technical efficiency, when it's not policed by thematic context, it just leads to this huge organizational debt. And that debt always comes with crippling reputational risk.
That $60 pistol ended up costing them tens of thousands in lost goodwill.
At least.
And the most probable technical explanation, the one that usually gets trotted out, is the placeholder pattern. The idea that the pistol texture was just a temporary placeholder during an early art pass and was simply forgotten to replace.
Right, but let's dig into that. A placeholder has to survive multiple layers of QA. It had to get past the art director, who should have spotted the 1,000-year anachronism immediately. It had to get past localization review. And most damningly, it got through the final asset compilation and playtesting phase.
So it's not just one person's mistake, it's a systemic failure of all the checks and balances.
Exactly. But here's the really big structural problem that made the community so skeptical. This specific defense, the placeholder slip-through review story, it wasn't an isolated incident.
Oh.
The sources confirmed this is the identical word-for-word explanation the studio gave for a separate concurrent controversy about them allegedly using AI-generated art assets.
Wait. They were dealing with two simultaneous high-profile visual integrity crises, and they used the same template response for both.
Yes, the repetition of that exact corporate line for two separate, highly sensitive visual errors. It suggests a deep structural weakness in their final QA pipeline. It moved the whole thing beyond a simple human error and into the territory of a corporate process failure.
And that's what leads to a complete erosion of trust.
The timing was just terrible. Having these two visual controversies, the easily verifiable pistol sale anachronism and the more complex AI art accusation, it severely compounded the damage.
It created this perception that the studio was just aggressively cutting corners everywhere they possibly could.
And it put their PR team in an impossible situation. The community saw the repeated placeholder slip-through line not as a credible explanation, but as a standardized, insincere corporate template. I even saw users joking about whether the studio was using ChatGPT to write its apologies. That cynicism was fueled by the whole AI art thing. In that case, players were using advanced techniques to analyze background art, and they were spotting the classic telltale signs of AI generation.
Like what? What were they seeing?
Blurry, inconsistent details, weird visual elements that made no sense, bizarre anatomical distortions in people or objects in the background.
And even after the studio said they had addressed it and removed all the AI content.
The community noted that evidence of AI artifacts was still allegedly present in important background scenes and even some cutscenes.
So that creates a huge narrative problem. If you claim you fixed a systemic error like AI art, but players can still see the evidence, then your much simpler explanation for the pistol error loses all credibility.
Precisely. The pistol sale error then acted as what we call a crystallizing error.
A crystallizing error. Can you explain that concept? How does one visual mistake become the lightning rod for everything else?
A crystallizing error is a simple, undeniable, visible mistake that instantly confirms all of the player's pre-existing anxieties about the development, about rushing, about technical debt. It's an easy-digest proof point.
So it connected to other older problems.
Exactly. This graphical error immediately became evidence of systemic neglect because users started linking it to long-standing technical issues from previous games. The most notorious one was this lagged audio animation bug that's been in the franchise for over 5 years.
Oh, I remember that bug. It was a desynchronization issue, right?
A really frustrating one. Over long play sessions, as your city got huge, the audio cues and animations would start to lag behind the actual game state. Ships would move slightly out of sync with their sounds, menus felt sluggish. It wasn't game-breaking, but it was so irritating, and it pointed to these deep engine inefficiencies.
And players were saying that this very specific chronic bug had now transferred over to 117.
Yes. And the logic there is brutal but clear. If your QA process is so poor it can't even catch a 1,000-year visual error on a pirate ship, it's definitely not fixing complex, chronic engine bugs that need a deep code rework. The pistol became proof of systemic neglect.
So let's break down the social response. The Reddit discourse wasn't just one big, angry mob. It's sort of segmented into three distinct camps.
Right. First, you had the accusatory and critical sentiment. This group focused entirely on the workflow failure. Their language was harsh, lazy copy pasta, rushed development. For them, this wasn't a joke. It was evidence that the studio put efficiency over art.
They believe that even if asset reuse is standard, doing it without any context is just unprofessional.
Exactly. Then you had the group that really gave this thing viral lift. The ironic or hyperbolic sentiment.
This is where the jokes came from.
This is where all the time-traveling pirate jokes came from.
Yeah.
People saying, literally unplayable with dripping sarcasm, or making jokes about Assassin's Creed and the pirates finding the Apple of Eden.
That kind of humor, while it's funny, can be incredibly damaging for a brand candidate. The game becomes defined by its error.
Absolutely. The intent is comedic, but the result is that the game's identity gets linked to this highly visible negative thing. The mockery ensures that this specific flaw becomes the headline, and it completely obscures any positive features the game might have.
And finally, you had the defenders, the defensive or contextual sentiment.
This group trying to mitigate the criticism, often out of brand loyalty. They jump in and repeat the corporate line that asset reuse is literally the industry standard, and that Anno has literally never been historically accurate.
So they were trying to use the studio's intentional design philosophy as a shield for what was clearly an accidental mistake.
Right. But at the end of the day, that simple image of a skull and pistols became the central lightning rod. It confirmed every latent suspicion the community had about cost-cutting, rushing, and the overall launch state of the game.
It's important to recognize that this whole authenticity crisis, it didn't just happen in a vacuum. It was tied into this much larger community debate about the fundamental depth and polish of Anno 117 at launch.
Exactly. The visual flaw gave a voice to a deeper dissatisfaction. Some players felt the game was just unfinished or raw and lazy as shit. There was a huge group making very specific, very critical comparisons to its predecessor, Anno 1800.
Which, to be fair, had years of development and expansions to build on.
Of course.
Yeah.
But critics were arguing that Anno 117 felt dumbed down, that it lacked the complexity they expected. This led to a really important distinction in the discourse, the difference between horizontal and vertical complexity.
Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Horizontal expansion is about making the map wider. You add more provinces, like Latium and Albion, more resource types, more goods spread across a bigger space. This is often seen as setting the game up for future paid DLCs. Vertical complexity, on the other hand, is about deepening the mechanics you already have. It means adding more population tiers, making citizen needs more complex, introducing intricate systems like the Research Institute from the last game.
And the criticism was that 117 was too focused on the horizontal.
Exactly. They felt it was spreading the player thin across new provinces while neglecting the vertical depth that really defines the late-game challenge and keeps you playing an Anno game for hundreds of hours.
The conversation then moved to specific beloved features that were just missing. Things that drove long-term engagement before.
Yeah, the one that came up over and over was the absence of a dedicated long-term collectible system. In Anno 1800, you had the zoos and museums.
Right. Those systems incentivized expeditions. They required complex logistics to fill, and they gave you these huge visual rewards and citywide buffs.
It gave you a goal beyond just supplying your population with more sausage.
So even though the feature would need a Roman skin, it was the mechanism of engagement that was missing. What would a Roman version even look like?
Well, the community had tons of ideas. Instead of a modern zoo, you could have a Roman menagerie. Instead of a museum, a collection of imperial artifacts. You could send expeditions to Albion to capture exotic animals, or send ships east for rare statues.
That fits the theme perfectly. A Roman governor showing off the spoils of the empire.
It would have been perfect. And the failure to include something like that signaled to critics that the game was just fundamentally lacking in those long-term engagement drivers.
Another big criticism was about the difficulty sliders, wasn't it? It wasn't that they existed, but that you could change them mid-game.
For a certain part of the hardcore player base, this just breaks the entire contract of challenge. They argued that if you hit a massive hurdle, a plague, an economic crash, and you can just open a menu and turn the difficulty down.
It makes every challenge optional.
An optional inconvenience,
Yeah.
Not a real obstacle to overcome. They felt it cheapened the whole experience. If you can just sidestep the challenge, then your eventual success, building that magnificent city, It feels less earned.
But to be fair, we have to present the other side. There were plenty of people defending the core of Anno 117.
Absolutely. The defenders argued that the game is functional, it's fun, it's stable, and it has good bones. And they're not wrong. They stress that the core DNA of Anno is logistics, it's resource management, it's setting up those perfect shipping routes.
For that group, the naval combat, and by extension the pirate sale, was completely a secondary issue. The main game is the economy, not the fighting.
That's the key defense. The game performs its primary function well. However, the strategic takeaway from the pistol sale incident is that even if your core mechanics are sound, if you fail on these peripheral thematic issues, you fail the player's implicit contract on coherence.
It proves that technical efficiency, especially when you achieve it by aggressively reusing assets without any context, it just introduces this huge long-term reputational risk.
The small oversight becomes the entire focus, no matter how good the core simulation is.
So what does this all mean? The core lesson here, not just for this one studio, but for any developer making a historically sensitive game, is a pretty brutal one.
The pursuit of short-term cost savings by streamlining your asset pipeline like copying one small texture across a 1,000-year gap is just a false economy.
That saving is completely negated and often amplified by the cost of managing the public backlash. You can't budget for viral mockery.
And the analysis offers some clear recommendations. To restore trust, you need structural change to stop this asset integrity debt from building up. Thematic coherence has to be a non-negotiable quality gate, just like functionality or stability.
So you need a separate review stage just for reused assets, especially when you're jumping between historical eras.
And you need dedicated thematic gatekeepers, senior design staff whose only job is the final sign-off on all these high-visibility, era-defining visuals. It's the only way to clean up that organizational debt.
It's just a fascinating study in corporate priorities versus artistic integrity. I mean, the developers made these intentional, calculated choices to break history, like adding powerful female characters, because they believed it made a better game.
And the community, for the most part, accepted it. They forgave the intention.
But then they stumbled catastrophically over this tiny accidental error. A misplaced logo with a flintlock pistol that didn't exist for a millennium, and the community couldn't forgive the apparent laziness.
They couldn't.
So, here's our final provocative thought for you to chew on.
When the line between acceptable artistic license and just simple professional carelessness is so razor thin, and one decision gets you praise while the other gets you viral mockery, where do you think the difference truly lies? Is the player's outrage really about historical accuracy?
Or is it exclusively about the intentionality behind the choice? The incident suggests players will accept almost any historical breach, as long as it's purposeful, it adds value, and it shows clear artistic dedication. A mistake, however small, suggests the exact opposite, and that is what they truly cannot forgive. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the $60 pistol that became the defining feature of a Roman Empire at war. We'll see you next time.